Chapter 25. The Swazis and the Zulus go to war. My search for men continued. I went to far cities and strange regions, and so it was that one day I came to the bare village of Pite Retif, and because I had been journeying many days, decided to rest over Sunday. This village was little more than a cluster of bare farms, but I was able to hire accommodations for myself and beast, and to pass a day and night most pleasantly. I had been prepared to leave upon the following morning, when by singular coincidence I met my old friend Donald Hawkins, foreign correspondent for a London newspaper. He had taken a room in the farmhouse at which I was staying, and when I had come down to the evening meal, I had found him sitting beside me. We greeted each other in happy surprise, but our words were cut short by the 300-pound bear at the head of the table, who held up his hand for silence and informed us that he was about to thank God for the food before us, and he did not want to wait all evening as he was hungry. These bears are the laziest and most hypocritical people I have ever seen. All that this old fellow ever did was to sit upon his front porch reading the Bible and drinking quarts of coffee. But for all his religion, he abused the natives in his employ most unmercifully. A Kaffir boy was fanning this enormous man while he dragged on through a grace which lasted fully 10 minutes. The droning words almost put the lad to sleep, and for a moment the fanning ceased. The bear stopped in the middle of his blessing, turned upon the boy, and cursed him roundly, then returned to the labor of thanking God for the food before us. Hawkins and I could scarcely suppress our laughter. In fact, the eyes of the newspaper man fairly streamed tears in his effort to remain composed. When the meal was over and we were by ourselves, I had an opportunity to ask him what he was doing in this country. He had arrived in South Africa over a year before to cover the Boer War, but at this moment he was after other material. "Surely you know that the Swazis and Zulus have gone to war," he said. I had to admit that I had heard only faint rumor of trouble. I had had no idea that it had come to actual war. Hawkins invited me to accompany him on the following day, when he was planning to ride to a point some 30 miles distant, where it was reputed that 2 enormous native armies were gathering to do battle. I accepted gladly, and the next morning we saddled our horses and set out for the battlefield. As we rode along, we talked of native warfare and of the reasons for friction among the natives. Pro-British though he was, he agreed with me when I said, "I am fully convinced that the Bears and the English have the same attitude toward the natives. I believe that when they see it would be to their own advantage to weaken 2 tribes by putting them at war with one another. Neither these bastard Dutchmen nor your own blue-blooded friends in His Majesty's service hesitate one moment." We both understood, however, that there was a second reason for this trouble, which sprang indirectly out of the Boer War. Many of the Zulu boys were hired as drivers by the Bears and the English. Neither side would let them carry guns, for teaching them the use of firearms was the last thing in the world they wished to do. But since for driving horses, mules, or oxen These boys were unsurpassed. Many were employed in this capacity. The result, however, was very detrimental to the young natives, weakening their tribal customs and morals without giving them a new set to take the place of those they were losing. This, and the proximity of Swaziland, led to promiscuity with Swazi girls. The two tribes were ready to cut each other to pieces at a moment's notice, and we realized that we were about to witness an important battle. We had proceeded some 15 miles out of Pite Retif when a most extraordinary occurrence quite detracted our attention from the Swazi-Zulu trouble. We had been thirsty, and seeing a spring bubbling from the rocks, had tied our horses to a convenient tree and descended some distance down a gradual incline into a ravine at the bottom of which the spring was located. After we had quenched our thirst, we stood looking at the pleasantly uneven country on either hand and talking of the great inroads made on the big game of South Africa. For instance, I said, while there were rhinoceroses all through this country some years ago, there isn't one within 100 miles of us now. I've seen plenty of them north of the Limpopo, but they are all cleaned out down here. Suddenly Hawkins silenced me and pointed to a small clump of bushes 100 yards down the ravine. "Isn't that a rhino lying there?" he asked. "Quite impossible," I said. "You would be as likely to see one on the streets of Cape Town." Hawkins was not to be satisfied, however, so I laughingly consented to go with him and investigate. I had a good deal of experience with these big, ill-tempered animals, and I knew that despite their poor eyesight, they are dangerous beasts, and best left alone. Their sense of smell and of hearing are so acute that their charges are often fatal. I felt that we would find nothing but a big gray boulder when we reached the brush, yet instinctively I noticed that we were downwind from the quarry. At 75 yards I saw that I had been mistaken. We were able to get a much better view, and Hawkins had been right. There lay a rhino, and a big one, of the variety known as black. I had just whispered that we had better not disturb him, when some little noise we had made reached him. His ears stiffened. He rose to his feet, sniffed the air, and charged. A man who has never had one of these beasts charge down upon him has no conception of the way we felt. This animal had all the appearances of an infuriated locomotive, and his two wicked horns seemed as dangerous as a dozen bayonets. The speed at which he moved was amazing. Our horses were 300 feet away. To reach them or to outrun the beast was unthinkable. There was no tree into which we might swing ourselves. We could do nothing but meet the charge. Each of us had a revolver, and I had a rifle slung across my back. But at this moment, when a wasted second meant disaster, I seemed quite unable to unloose the rifle. For a few moments I continued to struggle, then seeing that it was useless, I drew my revolver. Each armed with his puny weapon, we awaited the chance to place close enough shots to be even slightly effective. I had seen rhinos turned with a heavy charge of buckshot, and I had seen them come right on after being hit with the ball from a 600. There was no way of knowing what this one might do, but I felt certain we could not turn him. There is no accounting for the idiosyncrasies of individual animals, however. We opened fire on this rhinoceros at 15 yards. He hesitated, amazed, then galloped up out of the ravine and away. The rest of the day I took great care not to be dogmatic, for fear Hawkins might remind me of the rhinoceros we had found in a country where there were no rhinoceroses. When we reached the point where the two armies were reputed to be facing each other ready for battle, we found 3,000 or 4,000 Swazis drawn into line at the top of a low range of kopjes, awaiting attack. In the valley below them, some 2 miles away, were the Zulus, 10,000 strong. The Zulu army was drawn into the typical bullhorn formation, which I had noticed in Pondo Land. Occasionally during the afternoon, one of these horns would advance toward the enemy, a half-mile or so, but invariably it would retreat again. Sometimes the two horns alternated in this advance and retreat until I could imagine a great bull fencing, this way and that, with vicious thrusts. The natives were armed with knobkerries and assagas. They had shields of various shapes and colors to protect them from the onslaught of the enemy. Each army had 8 or 10 rifles, smuggled at the risk of life and limb from the English and the Bears. The men were dressed in paint and feathers, with red, blue, and white clay upon their faces. They were so hideous and fantastic in this array that they seemed scarcely human. Rather, they were the symbol of hate, yet these same men were kindly and generous in days of peace. We joined a small trek train of farmers and freighters who were drawn together in an encampment for the night. From this vantage point we watched the armies through our glasses, knowing that at any time the battle might begin. As evening approached, great fires were built by both armies. Dancing and howling, beating of drums, and wild singing disturbed the usually quiet air. Messages, no doubt, of a very insulting nature, were carried back and forth all night long, until by morning the excitement and anger of these men were at a white heat. At this point, however, a new element entered the struggle. Before the sun had fully risen, a Bear officer and his commando arrived upon the field. They took an advantageous position to the north of us, a little less than 2 miles from either army. The native armies, each of which was worked to battle pitch, did not attack each other. They realized the sinister meaning of that Bear commando. Likewise Hawkins and I understood. These Bears had come to fight the winning army. Not satisfied with setting tribes upon each other to weaken the natives wherever possible, they often brought their own armies to the battlefields to whip the tired victors. For hours the 3 armies held their positions without moving an inch. No messages were sent, nothing happened, but we could feel the air fairly alive with hatred, fear, and desire for blood. Sometimes it seems to me that in emotional matters, natives are blind to reason. The Zulus were well aware of the intention of the Bears, yet before the sun was halfway up the heavens, the Zulu chiefs were again working their men to a high pitch of excitement. This time they had to overcome not only the fear of the enemy, but the fear of the Bears as well. It was necessary to play upon the emotions of these men until they were blind to everything but their own anger. As we watched them through our glasses, we saw the Zulu chiefs speaking to their men, quietly at first, then more loudly, and more loudly until they were wildly shouting. and we could hear the noise even from where we watched. Then the singing, howling, horn blowing, and drum beating began. By noon, both native armies were lashed into such a passion that the excitement heretofore was mild by comparison. Suddenly, the wing of the Zulus, which was nearest us, advanced. Led by the king, it rushed up the hill toward the staunch Swazis. The king waited until he was within 50 yards of the enemy, and then, with a tremendous swing, hurled his assegai. This was the formal declaration of war, and the battle was on. There was an advance all along the Zulu line, and 10,000 black warriors, shining in the sun, surged up the hill to the attack. Each held his shield before him, and howled in defiance as he fought. For an hour the battle continued. The Swazi position was rushed again and again, but always the Zulus were repulsed by the foe, who were less than half their number. Many were killed, and many more wounded. Some of those hit by knobkerries in the first rush were on their feet and fighting again before the battle was over. From the moment of attack, however, the battle went to the Swazis, and at last these intrepid fighters poured down from the hill they had so successfully defended, and cut the Zulu army squarely in two. The Zulus wavered, then broke and ran. Some of them came to our little encampment for shelter. At this moment the Bear Commando rode into battle, for just as we had surmised, it was their captain's purpose to whip the victor. These well-armed and mounted men swept down upon the defenseless Swazis, never coming within the range of the poor weapons the natives used, and without suffering a casualty themselves. The bears fired volley after volley into the naked black ranks, killing scores and never giving quarter even to the wounded. They killed the natives as if they had been so many antelope, and those brave warriors continued to fight their hopeless fight, until half their number lay dead upon the plain. Then, with a last volley of assegas, they retreated into the hills, pursued by the bears, who came thundering after them on their horses, pouring a stream of lead into their backs. Half an hour later, when we were preparing to leave, the bears were just returning. Incredible as it may seem, they actually bragged about the afternoon's work. They called the wholesale murder they had committed a victory, and told of the fierceness of the natives, and what luck it was that they had suffered no losses at the hands of these wild black fellows. As a matter of fact, these bears had been in no more danger than the middle-aged sportsmen who hunt ducks on their private marshes back in England and America. Donald Hopkins was anxious to get his story in shape and on its way. Therefore, although it was night and the country rough, we rode the entire 30 miles back to Pite Retief, where we were able to get several hours of much-needed sleep. Chapter 26. Black Magic in the Basuto Mountains. I had sent a number of men up to my Caldon River concession, so after the battle between the Swazis and the Zulus, I went to Basuto land to see how matters were shaping themselves, and to confer with Queen Bering and King Lirothadi in regard to my work. I rode somewhat leisurely through that well-watered mountainous country, for the past weeks had been exciting and strenuous. The streams were running so high that I had difficulty in crossing them at the drifts. In every valley, horses and cattle grazed, because I held land in this region. The abounding fertility filled me with a deep satisfaction. The land reminded me of Scotland, with its hills and herds, its meadows and streams. I was thinking of this as I approached Maseru, the King's Crawl, built of stone and mortar high on a cliff. I was thinking that it was not so long ago that the proud Scots were building strongholds no less crude in a country similar to this, and that there was no reason why development should be slower among these people than it had been elsewhere in the world. The king and queen received me very graciously, as they expected great results from my project in Basutoland. Douglas, the American whom I had found at Bloemfontein, had started building 3 stone houses on my concession. As they were not yet completed, the queen offered me one of her houses in which to live, until I could move into a house of my own. I hired a boy named Nitsi to do my work, and having accepted the queen's hospitality, prepared to spend a season at Maseru. Nitsi was a short, heavy-set, dark brown fellow, with fine big eyes and white teeth that showed when he smiled, which was a great deal of the time. He was a very quiet and efficient servant, with a devotion for me which was quite touching. Although he was uneducated and slow-witted, he was thoroughly dependable. I had no idea that he would be the innocent agent of another's black magic, or that within these peaceful walls disaster hung over me like a sword. Some of my men were already at Maseru, and others arrived every few days. The first of my materials and supplies had come via the Pedro Gorino at Port St. John's, and from that point over the mountains via train. Work began in earnest. I rode all over my great concession, planned a town with many buildings, examined the soil, the forest of South African hardwood, and the river itself, and where it might be forded. I drew a rough map of my land to scale, showing the points at which the best timber and the best stone could be secured for building. Some of the land was clear, and fell in gently rolling hills and meadows toward the river. This country was perfect for grazing, and I planned to put herds of horses and cattle upon it in the near future. Other parts of the concession were steep and rocky, covered with a thick growth of timber. One hill rose abruptly from the valley floor to a height of 900 feet. Several streams wound across my land to feed the rapid river, and springs of pure water ensured a supply the year round for drinking. I planned for orchards and vineyards, and superintended the work on the buildings, which went forward rapidly. Any morning, when the dew was on the grass, I could go out with my shotgun and almost without taking aim, shoot enough doves for dinner. The river was filled with fish, and buck were plentiful. One day, as I was riding along the river bank, I sighted a herd of 70 or 80 wild ostriches. I could have ordered my men to capture them and pluck them, since they were on my land, but I decided first to ask Queen Bering's permission. She gave it readily, and ordered 100 of her boys to help me in the work. We herded every ostrich on my concession into one great kraal, and began our work. Wild ostriches, strange to say, are often better tempered than tame ones, and we had very little difficulty. An ostrich can administer a kick fatal to man, but when a small kaross of skins is thrown over his head, he will stand perfectly still and allow his captors to pluck his feathers. We secured 2 large wooden cases, and in these we packed our treasure. We took only the black and the white wing feathers of the cock birds, and by careful selection throughout the great herd we were able to obtain the finest shipment of feathers I have ever seen. Some of the primes, at a conservative estimate, were worth a sovereign apiece. I wanted to share my plunder with the queen, but she insisted that I keep it all myself. I had had some experience with ostrich feathers, and I knew that this lot, which I shipped to Cape Town to await my return, was worth approximately £5,000 sterling. Despite these strokes of good fortune, my visit was destined to be an unhappy one, for it was in this remote and secluded part of South Africa that the British made one of their most dastardly attempts at my life. Perhaps once again it was diamonds that aroused their jealousy. I had found every indication of both gold and diamonds on my concession, and I confided my discoveries to King Lorithati. In return for this confidence, he took me to another part of Basutoland, and showed me 3 of the richest diamond prospects in South Africa. We both knew that to mention a word concerning the wealth hidden in these mountains would be the first step toward losing our land, and we agreed to keep our knowledge a secret. But as everywhere else in South Africa, here in Basutoland there were ears trained for every whisper, eyes watching every movement. Thus it was that the agent of the high imperialist received knowledge of my hidden wealth. Afraid that I might acquire a shilling that he and his cohorts desired, he went into conference with the devil, and those 2 wicked old rascals conceived a most hellish plan. Here are the facts, as I learned them some months later. Old Satan had called to his aid a crafty native, whom he controlled body and soul, and having handed him a sealed vial together with complete instructions, had sent him into the interior of Basutoland. This native mounted his horse, and 2 days later arrived at Maseru. I noticed the appearance of a strange face about the kraal, but thought nothing of it. When this fellow started to become friendly with Nizi, however, I grew interested. There was something about the man that made me shiver. He had a long bullet scar on one cheek, bloodshot eyes, and thin lips. It was a face I had seen before, but I could not remember where. His presence about the kraal gave me a feeling of apprehension. I determined to ask Nitsi about the fellow that very evening. The matter slipped my attention, however, and because I did not see the native again, I forgot him entirely. Some days later, word came from Cape Town that the Prince of Wales, now King of England, was coming to South Africa. The kings of all the tribes were invited to meet him at one huge reception. Almost simultaneously I received word from Sagafaku, king of the Pondos, saying that he alone of all South African potentates was to be barred from seeing the prince. I felt as he did, that there was only one explanation. The colonial officials were afraid that some information regarding their cold-blooded conduct in Pondoland might come to the notice of the Prince of Wales, and they were taking no chances. I was incensed at their high-handed attitude, and determined that after I had eaten my dinner, I would dispatch letters to Sagafaku and Cape Town, seeing what might be done about the situation. I sat down to the meal, and as usual was served by Nizzy. It seemed that he lingered over his serving, but the fact held no particular significance. I ate heartily, as was my custom. On arising, however, I was taken with a giddy, faint feeling unlike anything I had ever experienced. I told myself that it would last only a moment, but the dizziness increased until the whole room was a blur before my eyes. Then my head began to ache frightfully. There was a roaring in my ears and a throbbing at my temples. I called in a native doctor who lived in the kraal. He was unable to tell the nature of my sickness, but honest enough to admit it. He gave me some medicine to soothe my headache, and promised to stay within the kraal so that I could find him at any time. I took the concoction, but continued to feel worse and worse. I spent a terrible night groaning and tossing and sinking away into delirium. Nitsi watched beside my bed with great sad eyes, and waited upon me all night long. The next morning I began to grow numb. The numbness crept up my arms and legs until I knew I was going to die. A yellow glaze came over my eyes, and the whole world seemed strangely discolored. I called in the doctor again, and he listened to my symptoms. He still was unable to diagnose my case, but he was sure that the only way to save my life was to rush me to Bloemfontein, where I could secure better medical aid. Suddenly the truth came to me. I knew that I had been poisoned. I called to my boy and said to him, "Don't be afraid, Nizzy, but tell me the truth. What did the man with the bad face give you to put in my food?" Poor Nizzy trembled like a leaf and rolled his big eyes. All that he could say was, "Fella do it, fella do it." English was still very foreign to him, and in his fright and grief he forgot the few words he knew. Luckily, the doctor knew both Basuto and English, and was able to translate for me. Nizzy told the story brokenly in his own tongue, his voice betraying the sorrow that he felt. It seems that the stranger had asked Nizzy if he loved his master, and if his master was a good man. Nizzy, who was very devoted to me, had of course proclaimed his affection. The schemer had then instilled within the boy's brain that the idea he was in danger of being discharged. Nizzy had asked if there was not some way the catastrophe could be diverted. This was the opening the scar-faced native wanted. He had given Nizzy the love powder in the vial to be administered secretly, and Nizzy, thinking to keep my love, had poisoned me. I forgave the boy and told him that if he would run and fetch a cart from the bears on the far side of the Caldon River, all would be well again. He went, and in an impossibly short period of time returned with the cart and a team of mules. He must have ridden his horse across country, and have swum the river, for he could not have taken the longer route by road, nor waited to reach a drift, where he could have forded in safety. I took no notice of it then. Time meant life and death. yet to my clouded brain it meant nothing at all. I do remember some things clearly, however. I can still see Nizzy as he stood watching my departure after Douglas and a Basuto boy had come to drive me to Bloemfontein. He was a perfect picture of dejection, his head hung and his shoulders drooping. For a while I was painfully aware of the rough road over which we were traveling and the terrible pace. Then somewhere along the way I lost consciousness. Perhaps it was hours or perhaps days before I awoke again. My dreams were filled with rivers and jungles. I lived over again the night in the bay at Kiensa, and again I was swimming forever and ever without approaching a shore. I was being devoured slowly by a lion who shoved his hideous face into my own, but above all, my dreams were filled with a native whose cheek was scarred and whose eyes were small and bloodshot. At last I awoke. I was between white sheets in a comfortable bed. Someone was putting liquid into my mouth with a spoon and soothing my forehead. When I had recovered sufficiently to understand the words of the woman nursing me, I found that I was in the home of a colored doctor who had saved my life by his quick thinking. He was a West Indian with a Scottish medical education and probably the only man in Bloemfontein sufficiently skilled to have pulled me through. The woman who was caring for me was his wife. Douglas returned to Maseru as soon as he saw that I would recover, but I remained with the doctor and his wife for many days. While I was convalescing, I was very grateful to these people and became attached to them because of their kindness. At last I was able to leave and proceed wearily for Cape Town, but I was not fully cured, for the effects of that poison are with me today. Chapter 27. The Meeting of the Kings. Cape Town was wild with excitement. I had arrived at noon 2 days before the Prince of Wales, and I had found the city decorated with flowers and flags. A bright canopy had been spread over the section of the dock on which the prince would land. Soon rugs of velvet were being laid on every inch of ground the royal feet might touch. The celebrating began a whole day before his arrival. On the eventful morning I went to the dock to see the prince come ashore with the whole British Oriental fleet from its headquarters at Simon's Town for an escort. His ship steamed into Table Bay. 1,000 flags and pennants fluttered in the sunshine. Guns on the ships and guns on the shore fired salute after salute. All the high officials in South Africa, from Sir Alfred Milner down, were on the dock to greet him when he landed. But when the prince came ashore, for all his braids and fine demeanor, I thought him no more royal or aristocratic than Sigao Faku, his shining black body adorned with nothing but a breech clout, an ostrich feather, and a necklace of ivory. After the reception on the dock, the prince was driven up Adderley Street with plumed horses, outriders, and a huge military guard. The carriage took him through the gardens to the governor's mansion, where the prince awaited the evening's reception and entertainment. It was the second night after his arrival that the reception was held for the native kings of Africa, and some 20 of us who could make no claim to royal blood. I was curiously unmoved by the pomp and ceremony of the occasion, and by the proud bearing of the prince. Great fires were kindled in the gardens, and native entertainers were brought to amuse the prince, and although these Kafirs did their utmost to play and dance and sing in a manner which would capture the fancy, there was little of the feeling of the native here, and little of his wild rhythm. These natives were like children, frightened to think of the great personage before whom they were being exhibited. At last the prince grew tired of the performance. At a wave of his hand the music died away, and the dancing ceased. Seeing the natives awe-struck and spellbound by the opulence of their conquerors, I felt defeat as never before. I realized that the English had secured a hold never to be broken, and that a man might waste his life in a futile attempt to change the situation without gaining so much as the sympathy of his own people. I began to feel that even Christianity, with its lessons of forbearance and submission, was hand in glove with imperialism. The unholy alliance between these two precluded the possibility of my accepting either. Yet, at this moment, when all my efforts appeared fruitless, and my life's quest hopelessly idealistic, I was tantalized with a glimpse of the promised land. I saw a bare possibility of turning defeat into victory. Here were the kings of Africa, gathered at Cape Town. Why not utilize the opportunity and bring them together in one great meeting? If harmony and good feeling could be engendered among them, old feuds would end, and the position of the native in South Africa would be immeasurably strengthened. If all the native tribes in South Africa could act as one unit, even the English would be forced to parley. The time was not yet ripe to form a Kafir union, but I saw the first step toward that possibility at hand. The next morning I hurried to Bishop Coppin and outlined my proposed reception. He was enthusiastic over the idea, and called in FZS, Peregrino, and Reverend Mr. Gow to help us plan the affair. We worked energetically for 3 days, and at last were ready. When the night arrived, every important South African king, with the exception of Segafacoo and Lerithati, was present. All my efforts in behalf of the former had failed to secure him an invitation to come to Cape Town. Lerithati faced another obstacle. He was by far the most powerful native king in South Africa. For years his tribe had beaten both the Boers and the English, and even when the Basutos surrendered, they had demanded the right to retain certain liberties and concessions unknown to their weaker neighbors. Because of his strength, the colonial officials were particularly anxious to keep Lerithati from the meeting of the kings, for fear that his influence might affect a coalition and work infinite harm to the colonial cause. He would have been the logical king of such a union. The English invited him to a small private reception at the governor's mansion, to be held on the same evening as our meeting. They knew that Lerithati would not dare to refuse. They were right, but Lerithati saw through their trick, and although he could not come, he sent his brother to represent Basuto land. We were forced to be satisfied. Never perhaps was such a picturesque throng gathered under one roof. Here were 18 full-blooded kings, who had fought among themselves all during their generation, perpetuating feuds which ran back to the very dawn of time. These men and their fathers had led their tribesmen through subtropical forests, down rivers, across Kourou and Veld to the sound of drums, and under the anger of old grievances fought terrible battles, yet here they were, dressed as carefully as English gentlemen, with high-top hats and Prince Albert coats, a little stiff perhaps in each other's presence, smouldering perhaps at the fierce eyes of a rival, but to all outward appearances polite and decorous. They were meeting for the first time to shake hands and become acquainted. The event was momentous. Here, if only the right words might be spoken and the right influences brought to bear, Ethiopia might be reinstated in all her former glory, or even better, lifted to a level of civilization more cultured, prosperous, and powerful than ever before. Although the 18 kings were dressed formally, their retainers and heirs apparent were arrayed in all their barbaric splendor. I was aware how thin the veneer of European culture actually was, and how thoroughly these people retained the characteristics of their race, characteristics quite as worthy as those the Europeans would force upon them. Bishop Coppin made the address of welcome, and his deep voice filled the room. He finished by saying, "African brethren, meet and converse, and part as friends. The great God who watches all his children has not forgotten Ethiopia, and he will lift you from misery if you will but love one another." The kings and their interpreters made replies to this speech. The strained silence of the early evening was broken, and the room gradually filled with the hum and mild thunder of many voices. A dozen dialects were spoken, some musical, some filled with the clicks which mark Hottentot derivation, some blended with Dutch and English. Kings became friendly, even jovial. We all banqueted on roast chicken, and scores of nicely browned birds disappeared as if by magic. When we had finished eating, Bishop Coppin asked all the kings, Peregrino, Reverend Mr. Gow, and me to step to the middle of the room. Here he had us join hands about him, while he led us in his own song, "Ethiopia, stretch out thy hands," which had recently been set to music. The natives had a wonderful ear for music, and although most of them did not understand the words, they all understood the melody and rhythm. By the third time through, the 18 kings and their 300 retainers had joined in singing the Christian hymn. Again and again they sang it. The harmony grew wilder and more wild, the rhythm more and more barbaric. They drummed upon the table, they sang weird minor strains. Alto, bass, and tenor came deep and clear, and kings who had fought for untold generations held hands and sang a song which conquered even the most stubborn heart among them. Chapter 28. Ah, South Africa, land of villainy, blood, and tears. Soon after my return to Cape Town, matters began to shape themselves in such a way that I felt able to buy the rest of the materials for my concession in Basutoland. Price made himself very useful to me, and worked his way so thoroughly into my confidence that I trusted him more than I should have trusted any one. He was continually bringing me bargains of one sort or another, and he seemed so sincere in his efforts to help me that I gave him the power to make all the contracts for materials to be sent up to the Caledon River. I fully outlined the limits of my resources, never dreaming that he would willfully plunge me into debts I could not hope to erase. But ah, South Africa, land of villainy, blood and tears, it was his sole aim to overwhelm me. It was his particular commission as a colonial official to ruin me and force me from South Africa. It was many days, however, before I began to suspect him. The offer of backing which he and his bankers had made was renewed upon my return to Cape Town, and this more than anything else allayed my suspicion. I felt so secure and prosperous at this time that I had the Pedro Gorino put in dry dock for the installation of power. She had been making a good profit, but I realized that no sailing vessel could hope to compete with the power-driven ships which were becoming so numerous along the coast. As payments came due on materials, however, my ready cash dwindled. This was no cause for alarm. I had a fortune in ostrich feathers locked in my warehouse. In my pocket were 16 unregistered diamonds, worth a small fortune. There was my ship, the Pedro Gorino, and above all, there was my concession in Basuto land, merely awaiting a few shiploads of materials to develop its resources and make me independently wealthy. The lack of ready cash merely meant that I would have to sell the ostrich feathers or the diamonds, or negotiate a loan. It was then that I told Price of my ostrich feathers, which was, I have no doubt, the opening he sought. My warehouse was a small one-story building of stone, several hundred feet behind my office. It was here that I was keeping my feathers, awaiting the right market and the right price. When I found that I would have to sell, I wanted another's valuation on the plumes. It was for this reason that I took Price to see them. I opened one of the cases and took several number 1 primes, the kind that buyers dream about. Price could not hide his amazement, and when I asked him the value of my hoard, he estimated it, as I had, at £5,000. It was late afternoon as we locked the warehouse behind us, and I was fully determined to sell the feathers on the following morning. I went to my office and began to figure rapidly. With the extra £5,000, yes, I could make it. I would be able to pay for everything. My materials were ready to load aboard the Pedro Gorino. In 5 more days the ship would have power. No longer would it be at the mercy of the winds. I sat in my chair thinking and dreaming of the months to come. It would be hard to divide my time between the Pedro Gorino, with its newly installed power, and my concession employing 75 men. Within the year I could buy Lourenço Marques and the Portuguese colony if the offer still held. I would show the imperialist that an Ethiopian could gain by fair means all that they were gaining by foul. Perhaps I fell asleep, for I remember dreaming of Africa as it had been before the ships from Europe reached her shores, and Arcadia, with whole races living the quiet pastoral life of herdsmen, a country unravaged by war and inhabited by a people without lust for wealth or land. I saw forgotten nations laying their masonry at Kami and Zimbabwe, men of astonishing culture for that remote epoch. I do not know how long I slept, but when I opened my eyes, I found the room suffocating with the fumes of burning animal matter. Heavy black smoke was pouring in through an open window. My senses were still benumbed by sleep, yet I thought intuitively of the feathers. I rushed out to my warehouse and stood speechless at the destruction going on before my eyes. The wooden roof of the little stone building was a mass of flame. The padlock was broken, and through the open door I could see my priceless ostrich feathers poured from their cases into one great pile upon the floor, and burning like so many autumn leaves. They must have been soaked in oil to have burned the way they did. There was nothing I could do. The goods were already ruined. A little group who had gathered as the flames were seen afar stood in the half-darkness with the light of the fire upon their faces. They laughed grotesquely. Their vacant faces registered faint amusement. I stood apart, sharing my grief and my suspicions with no one, because it was a tiny building at a safe distance from any other. No one had been called to fight the fire. After the roof had collapsed, the crowd began to move away. They were not interested now that the fire had died down. I spent a sleepless night and returned to my office the next morning, prepared to do what I could. Unfortunately, my feathers had not been insured, and the burned goods were a total loss. My assets now consisted of a ship being held in dry dock, awaiting payment for the installation of power, a concession in Basutoland, which was mine to develop and to exploit, but not personal property in the eyes of the colonial officials, and therefore not security for a loan, a sum in the bank insufficient to meet 1/10 of my debts, 16 diamonds which were unregistered, and therefore impossible to sell except at a great risk, and a promise of a loan from men whom I was beginning to distrust. There were two possibilities. I could attempt to sell the diamonds, or I could attempt to get the loan. I determined upon a bold and dangerous stroke. Slipping the leather wallet which contained my 16 rough diamonds into my pocket, I walked down to the dock and looked out across the bay. A British mail steamer lay at anchor some distance out, and as it was early morning, only a few passengers were as yet on deck. For some minutes I hesitated, telling myself that I was attempting a foolhardy feat. Then, renewing my resolve, I hailed a boat and went aboard. For 20 minutes I wandered up and down the deck, attempting to read the character of each I saw. There really was little choice. There was a lady of 50, a boy of 12, a group of young men and women, and an old fellow sitting in a deck chair, reading his paper. More because the others were hopeless than for any other reason, I picked the last mentioned. The man whom I approached was an Englishman in his late 50s. He was slightly bald and stout, with an expression akin to ferocity. Yet something within his eyes told me that beneath his forbidding exterior there was a gleam of humor and of sporting blood, a spark of sentiment and amiability. He would not have been my choice from among 50, but he seemed the most likely prospect, and I was not without hope. I sat down beside him and began the conversation, casually enough. "How do you like South Africa?" "This bloody weather," he said. "It's always chilly at this time of the year," I explained. "Now, if you had come in January, let us say—" "I ought to know," he interrupted. "I've been coming out here for 20 years. I was taken aback at his brusque manner, and about to think better of mentioning the diamonds, but it was too late. "What is it you want?" he asked. I decided that there was nothing for it but to beard the lion in his den. "I have in my pocket," I said, 16 rough diamonds which you can have for a quarter of their worth. If you don't care to buy them, I'll not take your time." As I had half expected, the shock cracked his rough shell. He was truly amazed, and in a very different tone asked, "I say, do you dare take this chance with the law? What is it?" For reply, I pulled out the leather pouch, opened it, and having first made sure there were no other spectators, poured the diamonds into the cup of my hand for his examination. He produced a monocle and surveyed them critically. "A damn fine bunch of stones," he said. "I happen to know something about diamonds myself. Yes, I'll take them." He began to feel for his billfold. "I'll have to go to my stateroom for money," he said. 1,000 surmises raced through my brain as I stood leaning with my back to the rail of the ship, awaiting his return. I thought how easy it would be for him to betray me, and I remembered with apprehension that he had said that he knew something about diamonds himself. Several minutes slipped by. I was aware of my heart beating regularly, monotonously in my breast. How long he took! At last he returned. My worst fears were realized. He was accompanied by 2 of the ship's officials, to whom he was talking with excitement. "There he is now," he said, pointing at me. "I'll see that he gets the limit. This business has to be stopped." They were still 40 feet from me. It was a moment for quick thinking. The pouch containing the diamonds was in the pocket of my coat, farthest from the Englishmen, and therefore hidden from them. With as deft a movement as possible, I lifted it from the pocket, and with a flip dropped it into the bay beside me. Those 16 stones are no doubt there today, a trifling addition to the enormous treasure scattered over the sea floor. I had not been detected. I was seized and searched, but there was not a stone on my person. They could do nothing but put me ashore. These 2 catastrophes, following closely, one on the other, with payments due and no cash to meet them, made me resort to Price and his bankers. I had not seen Price since he had accompanied me to the warehouse to look at the feathers. More than ever I distrusted him. If he was a scoundrel, however, I wanted to assure myself of his nature. He and his bankers had promised to back me to the extent of £20,000. I needed no such amount of money, but I did need 5,000 badly. I still had my ship and my word as a gentleman. I went to the cashier of the bank, told him my story, and asked if the offer they had made still held. He said that he felt sure a loan could be made, and asked me to bring my papers the next afternoon. The next day, at the appointed time, I arrived at the bank. A liveried doorman took my hat and papers, and I was shown into a room heavily draped and decorated. At a long, polished mahogany table sat 10 Englishmen, Price among them. I was not offered a chair, and for a moment there was a strained silence. Then the president, roaring like a lion, burst forth. "Captain Dean, do you think you can run South Africa?" I was dumbfounded. I said, "Price, what is the meaning of this?" Price sat in cold silence while the president continued. "You know very well the meaning," he shouted. "You're a diamond smuggler, an enemy of the British government, and a damned American nigger, and if you aren't out of Cape Town within a week, we'll put you on the breakwater for evading your debts." I was so enraged I could scarcely control myself, but with an effort to be cool I asked, "Are you the High Tribunal? Has your illustrious government come to such a pass that it must place its judicature in the hands of bank clerks?" "I am not here to be insulted," the president thundered. "You have maligned Cecil Rhodes. You have attempted to stir the Basutos, the Pondos and the Pondomeses, to rise and massacre their English neighbors. In fact, there is nothing you have not stooped to, and I demand an explanation." "It would be useless to explain," I said wearily. "You haven't the imagination to follow me, nor the philosophy to understand. I can assure you that all your accusations are false. I will not attempt more." "Then you refuse to account for your actions." "I have no reason to account to you for anything I have done." "Show him out, John, and remember, Dean, you have 1 week to get out of South Africa." I was shoved roughly to the street without my hat or my papers, nor was I ever able to recover them. 5 days before, had I been treated in such a manner, I would have gone after my revolvers, but the succession of defeats had somewhat subdued my spirit. My bright dreams crashed about my head, and I knew that I must leave South Africa with my work unfinished. Under the Roman Dutch law, a man may be imprisoned for debt, and I realized that the bankers would be only too glad to see me on the breakwater. Then, in my darkest days, I was again befriended by Frater and Elliot, who took the power of attorney over all my interest in South Africa, bought me a ticket for England on the British Mail steamer, and as an appreciation for old services gave me £75 sterling on which to live. The next morning I went down to the dock, called my crew together, and told them the situation. I shook hands with all my men, and dismissed them sadly. Sidney Wilson, Will Braithwaite, and I went over to see the Pedro Gorino, where she lay in dry dock. She was newly painted a deep green with Pedro Gorino lettered in white on her bow. Her mast stood proudly, remembering old storms, and although no one spoke of it, we all were thinking that perhaps it was best to leave her thus, and never hear the angry rumble of an engine in her vitals, or see the wild, free spirit of her broken and surely, and the ship plunging on without regard to wind or waves. And that was the last I ever saw of the Pedro Gorino. Next morning I boarded the British Mail steamer and headed northward through the South Atlantic. Driven from my motherland by foreigners and usurpers, I had no desire to go on to England, so I slipped ashore at Funchal, Madeira, a fugitive from justice, and I thought how like I was to Said Kafou and McKinnon Page, who had come to Funchal a century and a half before, and like those two, I haunted the resorts of seamen that lie along that dirty, lively, wild crescent bay, seeking passage aboard any ship for any country whatsoever. The end.